Okay, you're not hearing any audio, Dr. Kambon, is that right? IT, can you help out? All right, there we go. Yes, it's time to get started, and I will introduce you now, and we will go forward. Welcome, greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining this next session of the AHSA University of Cape Coast and PANAFEST Colloquium on the African family. We are having a session. We're having a session that will be focused on what we call and talk about as building Africana studies, theory, methodology, and practice. We always have a session at our conferences that focus on some of the epistemological worldview and other issues central to creating the foundation of Africana studies in our work. Today we are very honored to have with us Okunini Obadele Kambon, someone I have known for ages, who will give us a presentation entitled Akan Ananse Stories, Yorùbá Ìjàpá Tales, and Dikènga Theory, Worldview and Structure. That's the title. He's going to do a PowerPoint presentation and speak, but let me introduce him to those of you who may not be familiar with his background. Okunini Obadele Kambon is also known as Nana Kwame Pembe Dati I. He is a world-renowned master linguist, scholar, and the architect of Ubibi Tumi, the oldest and largest Black social education network on the planet. He completed his PhD in linguistics at the University of Ghana in 2012, winning the prestigious Vice Chancellor's Award for the best PhD thesis in the humanities. He also won the 2016 Provost Publications Award for the best article in the College of Humanities. In 2019, he was the recipient of the Nana Marcus Messiah Garvey Foundation Award for Excellence in Africana Studies and Education. Okunini Obadele Kambon was awarded the 2021 University of Lagos UNILAG Area Cluster Center Fellowship, where he contributed significantly to the work of reconfiguring African studies. He is a senior research fellow and head of the Language, Literature and Drama section of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, and is editor-in-chief of the Ghana Journal of Linguistics. He has served as secretary of the African Studies Association of Africa from 2015 to 2020, where he served as the secretary. He also played an instrumental role in 34 Africans of the diaspora receiving Ghanaian citizenship in 2016, and 126, including moi, receiving citizenship in 2019. He now assists others interested in repatriation via repatriate2ghana.com, nominalization, historical linguistics, hematology, and African Black liberation. Brothers and sisters, Okunini Obadele Kambon. Over to you.
Medase, thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. That'll be all right. Okay, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
All right. Is it still clear? I just switched to what is that? Theory, dealing with the Congo as a shared African world view at the in terms of stylistics. And this is a map that shows a representation of the places where these stories and where this theory comes from. So you see Akan at the far right, and then there on the left you find the arrow that shows when it was. And in terms of scope, all right, so we're going to look briefly at what is DIKENGA. So we're going to go to Nkulu Fukiao for the answer to that, where he says, according to Congo teaching, nothing exists that does not follow the steps of the cyclical Congo cosmogram. People, animals, inventions, social systems, and so on are conceived, yakwa, yindulwa, and live through a kind of pregnancy, stage 1. They are born, Butswa, stage 2. They mature to Kula, stage 3, and then they die, Fwa, at the collision stage in order to undergo change, stage 4. So when he says nothing exists that does not follow the steps of the cyclical Congo cosmogram, this is to say that every single thing that exists follows these stages. And, you know, basically, this is now a testable hypothesis because of it being phrased in this way. And we're going to see, does DIKENGA, does it actually follow? Does the Ananse do the Ananse given? So we give this as an African narrative structure. Excuse me. And again, this is what was just mentioned, where we can see, you know, very clearly you have Luvemba on the far. Now, in another talk, Nkulu Fukiao, and you can find this online, and it's entitled The Ancestors and Our Connectedness to Them. He actually starts with Luvemba, and the reason why is given in his book, Self-Healing Power and Therapy, which is rendered in Kikongo as Lendo Kia Kukinyakisa or Lendo Mu Kukinyakisa. And in that book, he gives a proverb, Tufua Musoba, which is we die in order to undergo change. So basically the idea is that November is the end of one cycle, that's the death, but then that is the very point, which is the beginning of another cycle. And that's oftentimes rendered as a snake with its tail in its mouth. So the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. Now, usually whenever I give a presentation, I like to make it as interactive as possible. So when I say Ananse, I want you to say Dikènga. Let's try that. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Dikènga.
Very good. And when I say Ìjàpá, I want you to say Dikènga. Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Good. So either of those will elicit the same response of Dikènga. Ananse.
Dikènga. Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Very good. We'll try that out and see how that works out. So why Dikènga? Well, I work at the Institute of African Studies, and at the opening of the official opening of the Institute of African Studies, Nana Kwame Nkrumah said, one essential function of this institute must surely be to study the history, culture, and institutions, languages, and arts of Ghana and of Africa in new African-centered ways, in entire freedom from the propositions and presuppositions of the colonial epoch, and from the distortions of those bases of this new assessment. of the are shared by countless Kemetu. That's what we're going to look at rather. When we say Kemetu, we're talking about African equals Black people. Now, this is something that you're usually probably not used to seeing, but we actually use the equal sign so that you understand when we say African, we mean Black, and when we say Black, we mean African. So any invaders who are not Black, well, they're not African in our view. Also, if we can use Eurasian conceptual frameworks to analyze African phenomena, we can at the very least try something from contemporary Kemet, and that's to say the land of Black people, and only Africa. I'm hearing someone saying that they're doing a conference at the same time. I think that's Mama No Bantu. So if you can go on mute, that would be a big help to me. So much of the study of Africa is from a backwards forwards paradigm. And when we're dealing with African centered, this may entail looking circumspectually, meaning around, instead of looking at backwards forward. When I say backward forward, it's usually that people will look back to, I'll say they look forward to, Western Eurasia or America for their frameworks, and then they look backward towards the village that they come from in order to get the raw material. And this is also what I refer to as galamsey research. Galamsey, you go get an excavator from somewhere that you import, you go and get the raw material, which is the alluvial gold, and then you export it with no value addition. In many ways, this is what our research paradigm has been on the continent, but we're going to basically not just speak against that, we're going to act against that by doing something different. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Very good. So we're going to look circumspectually instead of looking at that forward-backward paradigm. And we're going to do that synchronically and diachronically. That means contemporary to our times and then also at a different time for our conceptual frameworks and for our philosophical paradigms. And, to be African as cultural pluralism, and rather than, or at least in addition to cultural specificity. And we're going to look at these of remembering the dismembered continent in the line of Ata Aikuyama 2010. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Very good. And I'm not going to read this word for word, but essentially Nana Kwame Nkrumah is talking about studying Africa in the widest possible sense in terms of its underlying unity. This means that I can look at what differentiates Ìjàpá Tales from Ananse's stories, but what we're looking for, we can look at our river and we can analyze every single branch, also zoom out and then look at the river as ultimately one phenomenon, right? So again, Nana Kwame Nkrumah exhorts those of us who are working there, and then I could say even beyond, that we should not be limited by conventional territorial or regional boundaries. I would say these are the neo-colonial cages. And he says that this is an institute of African studies, not of Ghana studies. And he says that these investigations must lead outwards to the explorations of connections here in Ghana and then those beyond the shores of Ghana, right? That we can only be understood in the total African context. And then we ask the question once again, why not Dikènga? So when I'm doing literary studies, I get a master one in languages and literature track, we would be exposed to what's called free text pyramid. We're going from left to right. You have an exposition, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, a denouement, and then that's it, right? Now, we know, first of all, that pyramids were first constructed in the land of Black people, right? That is here on the continent that we now call by the Latin name Africa. So one, we will first acknowledge that that's an appropriation in the first place. So we can use pyramids because we own pyramids. But then beyond that, we could say if we can use the Eurasian appropriation of the shape of a pyramid, we should at least be able to use our own worldview however we see fit. And then again, you can see studies as recently as 2006 and 2014 using, and these are in this case, Black people, Kupeka, using this Freitag experiment. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Very good. And one thing you'll learn about me is it's not possible to fall asleep during one of my presentations, because if you try to, one of your neighbors will wake you up by saying Dikènga right in your ear. So it's all, there's a method to the madness. So when we're looking at Dikènga, you can see Musoni. This is the idea, the seed, the conception, and this is also midnight. And this is referred to as Indingo the kala, that's the beginning of the story. So a child and son who's living is into a warrior, right? And this is a formula to mark the transition from one state to another. You have Tukula, that's the climb. You have Luvemba, that's the end of the story, Isinku, the closing formula. And then once you go through this closing formula, and I can ask this question of you, when the sun sets, does the sun stop existing? Anyone is, can answer that?
No.
Very good. I can say anyone who's lived for more than 2 days can answer that. Sun is not existing once it sets. And then by the same token, the story does not stop existing once the story ceases to be told. And we'll go more into that. And this is why we have, some people would say belief in reincarnation. I would say knowledge of reincarnation, that everything that exists now around us, 1,000 years ago, everything looked very different. What is now your left hand, all the blood and the water that's in that blood looked very different 1,000 years ago, much less 1,000,000 years ago, much less 4 billion years ago. So nothing is created or destroyed, it's only transformed. And then also we can look at how 5 of the 8 major Kometsu initiation rites occur in the realm of the living, 2 of which actually straddle the realms of the living and that of the ancestors. So that will correspond to, on the top left, in Seluka, Kinsamina, Mbata, Nsinsa, and Ndimina. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Very good. And those of you in the auditorium can also do so, even though I won't be able to hear you for now. Now, what we have is, this is a very common sun versus life analogy. So among the Yoruba, they will have an expression like Aye la bafa, or Sangongo ni gbagbo wolede. That translates to, it is in the world that we met Ifa. It wasn't until high noon that Christianity, literally belief, entered and arrived, right? And then you have names like Bantale, which translates to stay with me till night. Now, this isn't literally night, it's talking about metaphorical night, saying stay with me, all the way through to a long life. You'll find this time again, Losangongon, which is in high noon, right? Saying that the person died at high noon, it means that they did not complete their life to eldership. You see this again, Osangongon, in this other Ìjàpá tale. And then you see a book on Yoruba idioms, Arojo. This literally translates to morning of the day, Igbaewe, Nibere Ojo, and that translates to childhood. So the way to speak about childhood is to say that that is like the morning of one's day. You find the same thing in Akan, where you have this sun life analogy where you say Adam Fufansuntina or Chinya Newiawu, and it translates to, because of getting friends, who of course are not good friends, is the reason why Ochi, the antelope or duker, got its death at high noon, death during the sunlight, literally. And you'll find basically like these proverb texts, which would say something like, Moma Yamanye, Moma Yanimfra, Moma Yasonsi, Moma Yemwu Ewiawu, and saying, don't let us die a death in the sunshine, an afternoon death. And again, you have this set of proverbs. these are in the context of a libation where it says, don't let me die in the day, don't let me die at night, don't let me die at all, but let me die. So basically, don't let me die in the day is fairly obvious. But then we say, don't let me die at night, it means let me have procreation so that I could be active sexually, and then have many children to perpetuate my name. And that's don't let me die at all, but then let me die. And it says, after that, I will join the ancestors, right? So these are complementary opposites. Ananse.
DIKENGA.
Very
Dikènga.
good. Ìjàpá.
DIKENGA.
You see, I'm catching some of y'all who start daydreaming and nodding off. I see I'm catching. So once again, you can look at the hourly time segmentation system. And this is, in its completeness, you have the Lobiangudi, which are the top, bottom, right, and left, and then Lobianduelo, which are the in-between or small hours, which are on the diagonals. And this corresponds to the horizon. That's the Kalunga line. And then you see that replicated once again here at the bottom right. And we'll go into how every story follows this exact same structure, that even though the sun sets, it does not stop existing. By the same token, even though the story ends, it does not stop existing. It continues to exist in other forms, in our hearts, in our thoughts, in our societies. Now, in a text referred to as a conversation or a dialogue between a man and his ba, you find this proverb in Middle Nature, and it reads, and it translates to life is a cycle. Now you find this exact same thing in modern day Benin, where you'll see a snake with its tail in its own mouth. And then that exact same theme you find on the outer shrine bark of Sarah Tutankhamun, where you see around his head is a snake with its tail in its mouth, and around his legs is once again a snake with its tail in its mouth. This lets you know that this is not haphazard, that we are very clear on this idea that life is a cycle. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
DIKENGA.
Dikènga.
Now, oftentimes when we speak about, any type of Kemetu phenomena or African phenomena, for, just to use that term, usually it's trying to describe it to non-Blacks, to show that we are human beings, to show that we can think, to show that we're not monkeys. But rather than just describing these phenomena, it's useful for us to use them as our conceptual and theoretical frameworks to solve our own problems. Now, you find this exact same type of idea on the left, where you see Obra Epiene Natoye, and it translates to life's sunrise and life's sunset. This is a gold weight that we used to weigh gold dust against in order to determine what could be purchased. And then here you see Obrane Abodemuyenta, and it translates to life and creation are twins. That is on the right-hand side, which is where you would store your gold dust. So again, you find this idea permeating. Now, oftentimes growing up in school, we're told about Galileo or any other random, cave beast who crawled out of his cave as the first people to understand that the world is round. However, 2,000 some odd years ago, you have the sarcophagus of Wesh Nefer, Imahu Wesh Nefer, where again, you find one of the earliest instantiations of the world being depicted as round. Now, what's interesting is that you see in Tangu, you see Ra up at the top, but then also you see Heru Behdet here in the center. And the idea is that we ourselves are living suns. So there is the sun, but then there's also us in the center who see the sun rise and set, and we ourselves are living suns. But we'll continue. So these are parallel analogous structures. So we can see that Urum, the sun, the human in the story, each one has a midnight. It has a conception for a human being, an idea of a story. It has a twilight, that's like pregnancy, that's like the formulation of the story. We have a dawn, which is like the birth or a naming ceremony. That's like the opening formula of the story. We have a morning, a late morning, a noon, an afternoon, a sunset. That's the conclusion of the story. Evening, that's judgment for a human being or reflection upon the story for the one who listened. You have the night, you have the ancestral realm, you have internalization. You come back down to midnight, the conception, the idea. So all the way, each one has This is what I refer to as parallel analogous layering structures, right? Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
So where it comes to opening formulae, you have this alo. Alo mi da fi ire gbagbo, o da lere ìjàpá. Ìjàpá ti roko, ọkọ̀ yánibo ẹsẹ̀ dandan bí ara ń pẹ́. Tó kọ́lé tó fi ran bàá jẹ́. Tí lọ láàrin ẹ̀pà, tí pàkọ́ rẹ̀ hàn fírífírí. Ó ní ọ̀pẹ̀lọpẹ̀ pé òun ga. So this is an opening formula. By the same token, I want to play this here very briefly. Can everyone hear the sound?
No.
No,
Okay,
no.
let me start the share again. I'll pause. I'll do a new share. Share sound. And optimize for video. Okay, are you here? So this is the rise of the sun. That's dawn. By the same token, a child has their sunrise, the naming ceremony for the newborn twin. This is a naming ceremony. That's like the dawn. You have the naming ceremony. It's like the dawn of life.
No.
Then the story also has the opening, which is again like the dawn. And then Akan Ananse also have the opening formula just like that. Abra bro. Very good. So that is the dawn, right? But then we also have the high point of the story, and we're going to look at that one as well. So this is Tukula. In Chi, this would be called Owijinaye. In Yoruba, we call Sangongo. And then in Neanderthal, aka English, it will be called Hanu. So let's look at this one too. This is an example of the high point of the story. Even if you don't understand Chi, you'll be able to hear when the high point comes.
Also, Massa, what I said, Sandy Atano. So, whatever I need to say, her mammy said, if it's so an arm of body, I should say, or come at what? Preocupa over Tiani, go. Oh, John, or can I do a poponi slow at Senamui? Son and no kum, and yes, a tiani, a guasibonim, and now buaki to a piano at the Gunche. I remember from us on the Cassim. Man from us on the Cassim. The man from us on the Cassim there. I see Bamabe, Obiara, and this all bus and then Fuga, and then finish Sida. Or rather, him, just careful. Sir, I look for Gusa, and I look for a Cresada. Ubiara.
You can get the Latin. Oni ṣebí ṣe báyìí náà ló wà ní ẹṣin ó ní ṣíṣí ni ẹ ó ní ẹṣin ó ní kápùn kó sínú ẹ̀kọ́ òun ti ẹ̀rí bó ṣe rí ó ní wọ ọkùnrin tì í kóun ti ẹ̀rí bó ṣe ló bá tì ó fi pàdọ́ọ̀kì sí ẹ ó yẹ wá rojọ́ ó gbà á rojọ́ aláìmoore èèyàn ni wo ẹkùn aláìmoore bí ó máa kú sínú wàyí èèyàn ṣẹ́ lóore ó kú sínú wàhálà èèyàn ṣẹ́ lóore ó kílẹ̀ sílẹ̀ wá fẹ́ pa wá ọkùnrin máa lọ lálàáfíà.
This is like the high point of your career. So the same way the story has a high point, in the same way that the sun has a high point, that when you're giving your inaugural lecture, that's the high point when you're in school, that's your high point when you're married, that's your high point. So you go from your dawn all the way up to the high point of your life. And stories function in the same way. Now the difference between this and fairy tale experiment is because as you as black people, we understand that when the sun sets, it does not stop existing. All right, so we'll continue. And then we have November, Oyatoye, or Iwo, the setting of the sun. So let's look at examples of that for both the sun, for the story, and for the human being. Now, interestingly, on the last ones, you found them translating Osebo and Ekun as tiger, but that's not an appropriate translation in either case, that those should both be translated as leopard, as there are no tigers indigenous to Africa. But because we get taught about any, mini, money, mo, catch a tiger by its toe, we know the word tiger more than we know the word leopard. So I just wanted to make that correction to the translations on both cases. But let's listen in. This is November, the setting sun.
A ó tún máa ríra o láyọ̀.
Jó mi jó.
Àsìkò ń tọ̀kẹ́rẹ́. Jó mi jó. Àwọn lọ́jọ́ ń jà. Jó mi jó. Ìjà rẹ̀ mo wá là. Jó mi jó. Àsìkò mi ni mo jẹ. Jó mi jó. Ẹ̀bà mi lọ́wọ́ rẹ̀.
So this is the closing formula.
Àwọn mi ń bẹ lọ́jà. Jó mi jó.
You have the closing formulas in G.
Itimana ti sɛ ma mbɔto yi so ɔyɛ dɛ ɔyɛ dɛ ofihyia ɔdeba.
So in Yoruba, you can have the closing formula. Idi alomi re gbangbalaka, idi alomi re gbangbalaka. Bingba puro ka gogo enumi maru. Bingo bakuro ka gogo enumi ro le meta. Odi bo bo bo. And then you'll say oro abi oro. Did it ring or did it not ring? Oro baba. So these are the closing formulas. It's like the funeral, the ritual that we do to close out the story. And now you have Musoni, which is Audacium, which is Oganjo Oru, which is a time of reflection and a time of contemplation and conception of the story. Okay, Dean. So this is ancestorhood. When you come back as Egungun, the terracotta heads for those who had passed on of the Akan. This is being possessed by the spirits of those who have gone before. This is the libation.
Ananse semi mukonyano wo suhu ayam wafa ofebedi akon 55, 56 ni mu.
Na anasesem no me nana ene to kire me when I was 10 years na oto edi kire me na anasesem enti ana me de bia me to ne se me nana na wudie so de bia me hono ma me kai sa na desem na ma me de kai na mami ato na se no yi o mami hu se ewiasim mami nyama bi se mi ni miansa e che obi afa so me hu obi a me ma nipa ni me nyama aduni se nipa no enye nipa hunu bia nipa bia ye nipa so yarifo so buani o e janko e dio me fa ni se o ye nipa
Use it to create your own conception and a reconception.
Ìyá, ó tún kọ́ wa pé ká máa ní sùúrù, ká sì má máa ṣe ojú kòkòrò.
Ẹ ṣeun.
Èèyàn má jẹ́ ingrate, èèyàn jẹ́ni tó mọ rírì oore, wọ́n have to be grateful. Ìgbèrè pé a bá ṣe fẹ́jà, kẹ́jà máa mú oore. Èyí
Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
So what we find is that the Amu, these non-Black Eurasians, they don't know where the story actually ends. They think it ends when it stops being told. But as the man who said he heard the story in 1955, but now he's retelling it in his own way, this is rebirth. This is reincarnation of that story. So for an African narrative structure, you have this text from the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It says, I'm Khepra in the morning, Ra at noon, and Temu at evening, right? And then on the left, you see Asir Hetep im Ra, Rapu Hetep Usir. And it translates to Asir rests as Ra. It is Ra who rests as Usir. So Ra is at the top, Usir is at the bottom at midnight, which is where Ra gets his regeneration. Khepra is in the east on our left-hand side. Then Atum is on the west on the right-hand side. So basically you have inversion of the one that you find in Congo in the southern hemisphere, than the one you find in Kemet in the northern hemisphere. And then you can find this theme once again at the Temple of Dendera, which actually depicts celestial phenomena, right? So when we come to the Dikènga theory of structural analysis, we can understand Dikènga can be used to understand the different points in the story, including the point after the story has stopped being told. And this is called Dikènga again, Tendwa and Zakongo. So this is articulated for the sun's movements, for the human life cycle, and then also for the development of the story, and what I refer to as extended analogy layering. So the Ananse Sim and the Allah is like a living sun, just as a human being is a living sun, just as the sun is a living sun. So the structure transformation is seen as key in structure, transition from one state to another marked by rites of passage for a human being, marked by formulae in the case of the story. So these are not fixed artifacts. These are living suns that are alive in the performance. And when they're not performed, they're not alive, but they die in the sense of an African sense of death, not meaning that they stop existing or disappear from existence, but just that they've transformed. Because remember the proverb, "Tufa musoba," that we die in order to undergo change. Now, this is something that we've been talking about since long before the time of Neb Khepru Ra. Now, this is Sarah Tutankhamun's one of his name, and it translates to the possessor of the transformations of Ra. And the idea is that me, you, the entire earth, everything that is around us is nothing but a transformation of Ra in another form. And then you'll look at how, science documentaries about how the solar system was created. You have in the beginning was all this gas that collapsed on itself. It got to the point where the atoms had no space to move, and then they fused together, emitting light and heat. And this is what we refer to as nuclear fusion. So anything that didn't become part of Ra at that point in time became part of Earth. And what became part of Earth became part of us. So I hope it's all clear. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Dakwa.
Dikènga.
So this is why we don't say belief in reincarnation. This is knowledge of transformation, because that's all that there is, khapra. Now, these exact same Amu, these exact same Neanderthals and cave beasts come to us with what they call the law of conservation of energy in physics, that states that the total energy of an isolated system cannot change. In other words, it is conserved over time. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but can rather change form. So now they'll come to us and then we'll bow down and say, oh, that's so scientific. Thank you so much. But this is what we've been saying since the beginning of the beginning. So this comes to reincarnation of forms, repetitions in a changed form. So this is MPEMBA as function. You have ideational outcomes, cultural outcomes after the story has gotten done being told, character outcomes, excuse me, and then structural outcomes to follow, alter, or discard received structures prior to rebirth, reincarnation, and retelling. There's the signification of received structures by means of one's own telling. And again, there are social outcomes, behavioral outcomes, and material outcomes. Ananse.
Dikènga.
Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Excuse me. So we have MPEMBA, parallel movements in MPEMBA, the unseen and the ancestral realm, as the Ananse story is being told. The Ananse and Allah itself is ideational and immaterial. So what goes on in the town, city, or nation after the telling is material. Excuse me. This refers to the principle of complementary inversion. So you can see what goes on after the story as being in MPEMBA, but then by the same token, we can see what goes on after the story as Kunseke. There are structural parallels, and if it is missing, if you're missing MPEMBA, that is to say, missing the point in time where you conceptualize a story, you come out with a story that's not well formed, in the sense that it does not cause remembrance, reflection, internalization, personalization. And she would say, in Toisson, it doesn't fall inside the ear. So where it comes to the structure itself, time for the Congo is a cyclical thing. That's it. It has no beginning and no end, excuse me. Thanks to Dunga, these are events, the concept of time is understood and can be understandable. These Dunga, be they natural or artificial, biological or ideological, material or immaterial, constitute what is known as Nkamba Miantangu, that is dams of time. So we see that with the Lo Biangudi and then the Lo Bianduelo. And this is why for Kometiu, what we celebrate is when you get to these major points, whether it is your naming ceremony at birth or your rites of passage into puberty, whether it's your marriage at Mbata, the high point of your life, or your installment, or your recognition as a community elder, or your funeral, that is what we celebrate. Now, because Amu do not see things in that way, what they just celebrate is mindless time. Every year is a birthday, so now go get cake, go get birthday cards, and so forth and so on, to the point that now Kometiu Black people are celebrating birthdays, but then they are not ever having a rites of passage, or they're not doing naming ceremonies, they're never being installed, they're never becoming elders. So we've gone from the time that's based on Dunga, these dams of time, to now mindless time. Anytime a year passes, we're going to do whatever white people tell us to do, to the detriment of the Lo Biangudi and the Lo Bianduelo. So when we come down to it, we get the Congo hourly time segmentation system, and then the Dikènga theory of story structure. So we're actually going to start at the closing formula. That's the death of the story, which is the beginning of another cycle. That is the tail of the snake, and then also the mouth of the snake. You have reflection, internalization, the idea, conception, formulation of the story, the opening formula, exposition, climax, resolution, and then closing formula once again. So where it comes to the functional structure, one of the most significant things is that you have an actual function to the reason why we do our structure in this way. So again, you can think about these episodes inside of the story as Dikènga inside of Dikènga inside of Dikènga. So it's basically a story, but then you can have repetitions, smaller repetitions inside the story of the formula, smaller repetitions of the song that keeps coming up, and repetitions of me saying Ananse.
Dikènga. Dikènga.
You're gonna have repetition of me saying Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
So my entire presentation is a larger Dikènga cycle, but inside of my Dikènga. So we'll look at examples of Nkama Miantangu, repetition of songs in a story.
Susu.
Yeah.
Sophie, àkókò fún owó tẹ̀mí wọ́n tó dá aṣọ báyìí ní àbúrò. Bíbá báyìí ìwò bíbá báyìí ọkùnrin. Mẹ́ta kò fi èrè jò àkùsí ẹ̀. Mẹ́ta kò fi èrè jò. Mẹ́ta kò fi èrè jò.
So we'll continue from there. But then we also have episodic repetition, where you find the exact same episode or parallel episodes throughout the story.
Now, my friend, no read on in Juma in our to yes, senua, yes, I don't know, senua, Baba, do you, senua, yes, senua, Benny Baynard, the one. Don't do Bruno. Now we do Bruno in our return. Yes, senua, yes. A brody Janabo, senua, Baby, debut, senua, yes, yes, senua, yes. A bro bubu nabo, senua, Baby, bubu, yes, senua, yes. But of it. Nina, the necessary from Nakuko. Yes, senua, yes.
So we have also episodic repetition. And then also between Akan Ananse stories and Ìjàpá Tales, you find the exact same story amongst the Akan that you find amongst the Yoruba. So for set one, how it came with palm fruits. So each one starts off that there's a famine. In the case of the Akan, there's a pan or that Ananse or Ìjàpá come across. They say words and when they find a whip, they say magic words and then it starts to whip them. So then they take it back to the ones who broke the scoop or the pan in the first place, and then they get them to say the magic words, and then they start being whipped for having broken the pan. So it's the same story, the same type of structure across these, supposedly different cultures. So symbolic of life and death. Obrania Borienta, that they are complementary opposites. Life and creation are twin, right? And this is part of the worldview that says, "Initoje didu, yokoje kikon," that one who eats sweetness should also eat sourness. Came into the world, as well as Ìjàpá gathers all the wisdom of the world into a gourd. And when I said Ìjàpá, I'm just trying to see if y'all are paying attention.
Dikènga.
Very good. So in both the Akan and the Yoruba, either Ìjàpá,
Dikènga,
or Ananse
Dikènga,
avariciously gather wisdom into a gourd or a pot. They try to hide the wisdom in a tree, and they attempt to climb the tree with the gourd or the pot on their front. The child or the hunter, depending on the story, advises them to put it on their backs. And then after they climb it successfully, they break the pot, and then wisdom spreads throughout the world. Ìjàpá,
Dikènga,
Ananse.
Dikènga.
You find the same story amongst both, where you have how Ananse
Dikènga.
got a bald head. In each story, you have a case for a funeral for Ananse or Ìjàpá saying that he won't eat. They get hungry, and then they go to sneak beans. They dump beans into the hat to avoid getting caught. Then they put on the hat, then they can't get away. And this explains, the beans burn the hair off the head. And then you have shame and baldness. So it explains why Ananse has a bald head. And then also why Ìjàpá has a bald head. Another case of the exact same story, how the desert came into the world, and then you have Ìjàpá, the snail, and Ossian's hunchback. Thank you. So in each case, you have Ananse or Ìjàpá. That they were friends and they were farmers. That there was a drought. The friend goes to Onyankopon or Olorun, and then they find out that rain was delegated to a hunchback. The hunchback tells him to go and lightly tap on the back for the rain. That's what the friend does. When Ananse or Ìjàpá
Dikènga.
find out of this and get up anymore. So then the hunchback dies. In each case, they try to frame the friend by hiding the hunchback inside of a tree. Then, the hunchback's body falls down. In both cases, the friend gets blamed, and the friend says, "Don't worry, I know how to find out who really did it. Put me on a horse and say that I have so much glory." When Ananse or Ìjàpá see the friend who gets the glory for killing the hunchback, now each one goes out and says, "No, I did it. I'm the one who killed him. I want the glory. And then they get punished. In the case where there's a desert where the farm once was, or in the case of the Yoruba, he's also executed. Kwekwe Nancy CC4, or how
Frozen.
the water of the animals. This is one that I grew up with in North Carolina. Ìjàpá get stuck from beating it, and they get caught in both cases. And then I think it's the last one. Again, the exact same story in both, linguistic groups. Ananse and the hare, very good. Or Ìjàpá and Ìgbín the snail. They go to set a trap. Every day, greed causes them to give up today's catch for tomorrow's promised bigger catch. Finally, they get an elephant, and they say, no, but tomorrow you're going to get a which is just empty leaves, but they don't know that it sounds so big. So they're tricked to finally giving up the elephant, for empty leaves or for a serious problem. So in terms of content, you see a repetition of episodes. You find a repetition of formulas. You see syntactic parallelism, semantic parallelism, songs, chants, phonological effects, alliteration, tone rhymes, wordplay, onomatopoeia, and idiophones. In terms of phonological parallelism, you find the same sounds occurring again and again.
Start here. Akekakike, I'm an angry. Some of my boy be rich, my boy be rich, my boy be rich, me that you don't me sending in every year. ɛhɔ a na titititi fi ase titi dan na wɔn ato
That's a
mu
sound.
no fi ase titititi ase no titititi ase no titititi ase saa o no titititi o titititi o tititi na wɔn apue ɛmɛ wɔn pue pɛpɛ wɔn ehu afi ase pɛsɛ wɔn ama no ɛwɔ to wɔn pɛpɛɛpɛ na afi ase na po afi ase po wo. Omudu opepepe net omudu ebi o shede ani mu net esi fi ase no titititi na bo prede ani kiki ro ma chiro se bo de ani oh na kiki fi ase no akika no oh na fi ase
So again, we find
the
the repetition of the sounds, the repetition of the idiophons and the onomatopoeia. And then again, you find semantic parallelism where the same thing is said in various ways. So, very good. Gathers the wisdom of the world into a gourd. And then they say, only a mad person is who says that he or she has finished learning wisdom in the world. Then they say the same thing in a different way by saying, the wisdom of another wise person is what does not allow an elder to be called mad. And then they say in another way by saying, a person does not finish learning wisdom in the world. And then they say in another way by saying, someone who asks does not lose the way. So semantic parallelism. And then you find semantic and semantic parallelism in terms of hyperbole, where they say, ni bakon, ni ilu, abahun, ijapa, iyamumu, opolomu, opagbo eranko, opototo iyan mefa. Ọ̀pọ̀lọjà mẹ́rìndínlógún ó pèpèpè kùjò pèpèpè kan sílẹ̀ kàdíẹ̀fì jẹ iṣu gbọ́lá iṣu ògbó àgbàdo tàpá òpọmọ èrè yòójú ọ̀pọ̀lọ́ wọ́n pọn abẹ sílẹ̀ ewúrẹ́ mú jẹ akérèmọdé wéwo ìràwé gbogbo ẹja sá wọnú igbó ẹranko wọ ihò àpáta ebi pa aráyé wọ́n rò hangogo ebi ń pa ará ọ̀run. So it's saying various ways of telling you how bad the famine was. It killed the clever, a whole corral of animals. It killed 6 different people, 16 market sellers. If rain dropped to the ground, a chicken would have eaten it. Yams didn't get ripe. Corn germinated but didn't carry any children. Black-eyed peas looked like the eyes of a frog. If they dropped a razor to the ground, a goat would take it to eat. This frog of smooth skin wore dry leaves as a cloth. All the fish ran to the deepest part of the river. Animals went to caves and boulders. Hunger was killing all the residents of the world. They were looking emaciated. Hunger was killing all the residents of the heavens. They were dry through and through. So all of these are different ways to say the same thing. Ananse. Ìjàpá.
Dikènga.
Very good. So in terms of overt functions of the Ananse story or Ìjàpá tale, one is that the tale is given an encrabia or destiny by its creator. The underlying functions include those of remembrance, immortality of the teller, where they say, when a person dies, his or her tongue doesn't rot. As you saw in the interviews, the person is saying, I remember my grandmother, or I remember my grandfather who taught me this tale. Also, there's function in terms of experience. There's a benefit of past actual hypothetical experience. And then we also benefit from vicarious actual hypothetical experience. All wisdom comes from learning. In Yoruba, we say, a person who falls into a pit teaches everyone else wisdom. In Yoruba, there's a proverb, you are wise, you didn't suffer. Well, who's your teacher, right? Wisdom without suffering, transcendental truths without historical restrictions, personalities, dates, places, or events. So it means that a person can learn wisdom without suffering from suffering themselves if they learn from the suffering of Ìjàpá or Ananse. And then there's also experience in terms of exposure to worldview, content, structure, in terms of underlying exemplification of our worldview as DIKENGA. As we start to wrap it up, we come to the worldview and structural parallels between Akan, Yoruba, Bakongo, and Kabetiyo, Black people, and structural parallels between Ananse and Yorùbá Ìjàpá in terms of motifs. So in conclusion, there's this idea that Amu, non-Blacks, Neanderthals have, that they think about time as an object in linear motion. So this is an idea of a physical interpretation of absolute time and linear motion, together with industrialization and progress, and it leads to a future time orientation in most countries in the so-called Western world. But we have to be very careful of so-called European claims to universalism, that they'll say at one point in time, everyone thought the world was flat. By the time that they were saying that, we had already traveled to the Western Hemisphere, right? And the evidence is left in the Olmec heads. The so-called Europeans have updated their concept of space as being round, at least some of them, but not of time. So they still think about timeline, storyline, deadline, and so forth and so on, because that's their worldview. But beyond our worldview, the actual reality is that time is cyclical. So on the left, you see a prototypically African space, and then a prototypically African time, that both of them are cyclical, whereas a prototypically so-called European space thinks about the world as flat, and then their prototypically so-called European conception of time sees time also as flat, and both are wrong. It's not just a different way of viewing the world, it's a wrong way of viewing the world. So in terms of future recommendations, Ananse.
DIKENGA.
Ìjàpá.
DIKENGA.
So I would submit that the structural ideas presented here can and should be applied to other areas. The rise and fall and rebirth of empires, such as Ouagadougou, which is called ancient Ghana, inappropriately, Nyani, which we inappropriately refer to as ancient Mali, Songhai, Nubia, Kemet, Kush, Aksum, and so forth and so on. We can also think about it in terms of resistance movements and oppression movements. For example, imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, slavery, convict leasing, debt peonage, sharecropping, privatized prisons, prison industrial complex. That by the same token, even though the sun seems to set on enslavement, it rises again, then we won't be so easily fooled when we think this is a new thing on the timeline. And this is a quote by my own teacher of the Kikongo language, Nkulu Kimbandinde Kiabunseke Fukia, who says, Congo. This is my very last slide.
All right.
This is my, all right, thank you for asking. All right, where he says, Diadi in Congo, Kandongila, Mono Ikadi Kia Dingo Dingo Kwenda, Butukisa, Kinzongidila, Yedidi Angolo, Zanzingila, Ingiana, Kadi Yateka, Kala Ye Kalulula, Ye Ngina Vutuka Kala Ye Kalulula, where it says, here is what the Congo cosmology taught me. I am a going and coming back being around the center of vital forces. I am because I was and re-was before, and that I will be and re-be again. So I thank you very much, Asante Sana, Mesdames Wase, Eshe Pupo, and those are my references. Eshe, Mete Mwatondo Maming, Dwa.
Wow, I think we can give him a round of applause. That was great. Fantastic, Blacktastic. We are very short on time, so if we can take 2 questions, maybe, I don't know if we have any from the audience, from the students here or online. 2 questions quickly. Comments? You posted a question earlier. Okay, can you just unmute and ask it quickly, please?
Yes. Greetings, Okunini. I wanted to ask, do you have any recommendations for a rites of passage program for children?
Very good. So this is a good question. What I would say before looking into a rites of passage program is look at what the children or what the youth will pass into, because oftentimes what I find, at least in places like the United States, is that we'll have a rites of passage program, but then at the end of it, the children go off to, KB's colleges and go off to work for IBM and Lockheed Martin. That in its indigenous context, the point of a rites of passage program is for the person to be a responsible member of their own society. That said, there's a book called The Heartbeat of Indigenous Africa by Nana R. Sambuli Mosha, which deals with traditional education amongst the Chaga people. And in it, he gives a lot of detail in terms of rites of passage there. In terms of like how the songs are sung, how the social influence of a peer group can stop someone from being lazy, all of those types of things. So you can hit me up for other resources, but I'll say that one just off the top of my head right now.
Madasi.
This is Madasi.
Are there any Afrocentric, I guess, online schools for children like from first grade on up that you would recommend?
Very good. There certainly are. There's one that my own children go to and that I highly recommend is Nana Wilson, Nana Baker, Homeschool Collective. I actually teach Yoruba for them, online. And yeah, I would definitely say, so check that out. It's they call it Wilson Baker, right? And it's based in the DMV area, DC, Maryland, Virginia area, but we teach it online. So in that we have Yoruba classes, Kiswahili classes, mathematics, there's so many different things, right? Very much in alignment with our worldview. So yeah, I would recommend that. Named after Nana Amos Wilson and Nana Ella Baker for that complementary balance.
And we have one more question.
Hello. Hi. Ananse. Features of the Christmas story is that it is intended to teach a moral. Teach a little children the facts about right and wrong behavior. But there are quite a large, we have quite a large number of Akan Ananse stories. In which the character Ananse was about cheating and lying, doing all kinds of bad things. And in the story, he's often rewarded for his bad behavior. What do we find the moral in these stories? Which Ananse is rewarded his behavior? What are the thoughts of this?
Okay, so that will have to be repeated because I was not able to hear it. If it can be summed up very, very quickly, because I know we're short on time.
Yes, what I'm asking is, when Ananse behaves badly, he puts up bad moral behavior, and he is rewarded in the story. What lessons are the children listening to the story supposed to take away from the story?
Right.
Yes.
Very good.
What is the moral meaning of the story?
Very good. So one of the proverbs that I shared, as a matter of fact, I'll just pull this up as a slide so you can read it for yourself. If you can see my screen, that it says, a person who falls into a pit teaches everyone else wisdom. And the idea is that once they see someone make mistakes, or hear Ananse make mistakes, or hear Ìjàpá make mistakes, then they realize that, okay, I don't need to do what Ananse did. There's a proverb in classical Kemet that says, Se neb sebat irf, and it translates to each man teaches as he acts. This is that you can learn from who's doing the right thing. And sometimes you find Ananse or Ìjàpá juxtaposed against, a friend with good character, the hare, or someone else. So basically that's the idea, is that you have a child who may think, oh, let me go and try this out. Maybe this will work out for me. Oh, let me be greedy. Maybe that'll work out for me. But then rather than having to experience it themselves, then they can learn vicariously through what Ananse or Ìjàpá has done. And they'll say, oh, I see how that ended up for him. It didn't work out well, so let me not try that in the first place. So that's the reason why they're set up the way that they are. I hope that answered the question as I heard it.
Okay. So we want to thank Okunini Obadele Kambon for that excellent presentation. We are at the end of the session, and we want to thank all of you for coming, both here in the auditorium as well as online. We will definitely be replaying this session during one of our evenings during this week. So look for that notice to come to you by email. So Madasi Pa.
And I'm Ms. Madasi.
Thank you. Stay black. Stay blacknificent. We'll be back for our next session in, are we taking a break?